So when Kohler studies with chimps, discovered how insight affects learning. And then another thing to know is cognitive maps, which is a mental image of one's environment. Okay, so there are different types of learning. Latent learning is a form of learning that's not immediately expressed. And there's another word you should know, it's learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is helplessness people feel when they encounter multiple bad events and they think that those events are due to lack of their control. And observational learning is when you learn something looking at other people's behaviors. So an example is the Bobo doll experiment, when kids who had a role model who punched the doll did the same to the doll themselves. Okay, there are different types of rewards. One is fixed ratio, which the reinforcement depends on the certain number of responses. There's variable ratio, which means a number of responses needed for reinforcement varies. There's fixed interval, which reinforcements depend on a fixed time. Then there's variable interval, which the time between reinforcements varies. Okay, so there are different types of drugs. Things that alter your mind and consciousness are called psychoactive drugs. Depressants calm neural activity like alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates, which are painkillers. Then there's stimulants that excite neural activities like nicotine, cocaine, meth, and ecstasy. And then hallucinogens are another type of drug that distort the perceptions, such as LSD and marijuana. So, and now moving on to memory, there are three basic processes. It's encoding, where the information is recorded; storage, where the information is saved; and retrieval is the information is brought into awareness and used. There's, there's also eidetic memory, which is photographic memory. There's sensory memory, which is short-term memory, which holds then few items before it's stored or forgotten. Then there's working memory, which holds memory for processing. Long-term memory, which is permanent and limitless like knowledge, skills, and experiences. And then there's chunking. And then when you're memorizing things, there's chunking, which means you combine things into small units, such as a phone number. And it's good to rehearse, and that's when you make information easy to remember. Episodic memory is a person's unique memory of a specific event. Procedural memory is a long-term memory for skills and tasks. Semantic memory is memory based on the meaning. That memory usually lasts the longest. Then there's anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. If you can't form new memories, it's anterograde amnesia. You can't recall old ones, that's retrograde amnesia. Another type of memory is flashbulb memory, like when emotionally significant memories are encoded incredibly detailed. Examples of this would probably be someone who remembered 9/11. There's also implicit and explicit memory. Implicit memory is memories that you can't really recall like verbally, like riding a bike. And explicit memories are you can consciously know like facts. Two techniques is priming is when one stimulus influences the response of another. Then there's recall, which you retrieve what you learned. Oh, and there's also two types. Sorry. The second thing you should know is recall, which is it's like in a fill in the blank test. And then there's recognition, where you recognize the answer right away, which is multiple choice. Your mood affects your memory, so that's called mood memory congruent. And when you're memorizing things, then there are different factors that affect how well you memorize it. There's a serial position effect, so you're more likely to remember the first and the last items in a sequence. There's framing, so the way that's presented affects how something is reacted to. And there's misattribution, is contributing a memory toward the wrong source. So if you watch a movie and you might think later on, like a couple months later, you might think you actually experienced, but in reality it was just a movie. And then there's proactive interference, which that previously learned material hinders new info, and retroactive interference, which new learned information hinders old info. When memorizing things and creating memories, these things might affect your memories. Suggestibility is people are inclined to accept other suggestions. There's bias, which you show favor or prejudice towards something. Then there's persistence, which continuing to believe something despite being proving wrong. So an algorithm is a logical rule that guarantees solving a problem, like a formula for a math problem. Then heuristics are rules to make decisions. One is an availability, which based on remembering an event that's easily brought up. And then there's representative, which is based on an idea of a prototype. A prototype is our idea of what comes to mind. So like when you think of a bird, you might think of a robin when you think of a bird, because that's what you're most used to. Then there's functional fixedness, which limits a person to use an object only how it's used. So suppose it's raining outside and you have a newspaper, you might not think to use a newspaper to cover your head from the rain because you think it's only for reading. Then there's language. There's different stages of language. Babbling stage, one stage, two-word stage, and telegraphic speech. Telegraphic speech is like when you just use like the verbs and the nouns. So when you say go car or hug me or me hug, so that's like mostly what toddlers do. You need to know what semantics, syntax, and grammar is. Grammar is a system and structure of the language. That semantics is the meaning, and syntax is like the structure. The universal grammar theory in linguistics is a theory made by Noam Chomsky, which the theory that the genetic component of the language, like that language is like genetic, as in we all like have a predisposition to use proper grammar. And when we're acquiring vocabulary, we have a predisposition to learn it. Okay, next topic is motivation and emotion. Motivation is the desire to direct behavior. So primary drives are like hunger, thirst, and sleep. Secondary drives are learned reinforcers like money and social acceptance. And another thing to just generally know is we always try to maintain homeostasis. Next topic is stress. Stress causes a person to feel challenged or endangered. Stressors are what's causing the stress and can be either temporary or long term. Their physiological responses, which is fight or flight, which as you would recall is our sympathetic nervous system. And then another thing you should know is the general adaptation syndrome, which is this alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. These are the different emotion theories. James-Lange theory is that event causes arousal, that you interpret it, and then you have an emotion. Cannon-Barr theory is that the arousal and emotion happens at the same time. The Shatter-Singer theory is that the event causes arousal, which then you reason, and then you get the emotion. Then the Shatter-Singer two-factor theory is that the event causes arousal, then you have cognitive labels, and then it causes emotion. Cognitive labels can be like your associations with the event. Okay, so this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. First is you have your physiological needs, then you have your safety needs, then belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. So what this basically means is that you won't want it's basically a pyramid, so you go up as you achieve each need. You'll be, if you don't have food and water, then you will be less concerned of achieving your potential and be more concerned about your food and water. When dealing with stress, these are the different defense mechanisms. You have compensation is when you're strengthening one to hide another. Denial is refusing to face the behavior. it out on someone else. Identification is attaching it to something positive. Introduction is conform feelings for approval. Projection is seeing your faults and foibles in others. Then there's rationalization, which you excuse and justify your mistakes. Reaction formation, which means you pretend you're different. Regression is act younger to feel better. Repression is putting things into darkness. Ritual undoing is override negative with the habit. And sublimation is diverting negative into acceptable behaviors. And then you also need to, moving on, we're talking about personality. There's two types of personality. There's type A, which is you're aggressive and urgent, and then type B, which you're more laid back. Okay, so you also have to know about the ID, ego, and superego. ID are like your instincts, ego is your reality, and superego is your morality. So think of it as like an iceberg, as some are unconscious, like your ID and superego, but your ego is more conscious. Okay, you also need to know the personality test. The Eysenck-finds personalities based on your traits. 16 personality factor questionnaire evaluates your personality traits. And then the Minnesota multi-phase personality inventory diagnosis mental disorder. Another test you should know is the Big Five. An acronym is Ocean or Canoe test. So that measures your openness, conscientious, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Another type of test is an intelligence test. The Stanford-Binet test and Waite test are both tests that question about your information, comprehension, arithmetic, similarities, vocabulary, and digit span to like find an IQ. Then there's Charles Spearman, which suggests there's a G factor, which is the basis of all intelligence. Then the S factor, which breaks down a specific intelligence. Then there's the Gardner test, which measures the different types of intelligence, which is verbal, mathematical, kinesthetic, musical, spatial, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and environmental. Another thing, just a quick fact you should know, is that an 100 IQ is most common. Okay, these are some projective tests. The Rosenbach inkblot test are 10 inkblot tests that participants observe and characterize, and the TAT test is a series of pictures in ambiguous relationships. People have to ask what led up and what will occur next. So one might think that the man is worried because he is stressed out about work. So that might tell you that the test or his test subject or client has anxiety about work. Next, we're talking about development. So the Kohlberg's theory shows the different stages of development. There's obedience and punishment, self-interest, conformity and interpersonal accord, authority and social order, social contract, and universal principles. These are all basically just moral principles that people develop throughout their lifetime. Another one is the sensory-motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And this basically has to do with your cognitive development. The sensory-motor stage is your senses with your motor response when you have curiosity about the world. The pre-operational stage is when you start to use symbolic thinking. The concrete operational stage is when you understand time, space, and quantity. The formal operational is like when you try to use abstract logic and reasoning. The next is Erickson's stage of psychosocial development. You have trust versus, these are basically like you either fail or you like kind of pass. So you have trust and mistrust, trust, autonomy, shame and doubt, initiative and guilt, industry and inferiority, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and ego integrity versus despair. Moving on to disorders, these are eating disorders. Anorexia is you try to be really thin and you start starving yourself. Bulimia is binging, eating, and then you're getting you purge your food, which means you throw it up. Then there's binge eating disorder, which you binge food, but you don't engage in purging, so that results in obesity. Okay, so these are all types of therapies that you can use. There's cognitive behavior therapy, interpersonal therapy, psychodynamic therapy, family therapy, situation-focused therapy, and person-centered therapy. Okay, so these are specific psychological disorders. autism, which is problems with social relations, ritualistic behavior, trouble communicating. The treatment is like behavior analysis, antipsychotics. Then there's ADHD, which is inattentiveness, hyperactivity, and that can be helped by behavior therapy and stimulants. Then you have phobia, which is excessive fear, and that can be helped by exposure therapy and antipsychotic drugs. Then there's panic disorder, which is due to repeated panic attacks and excessive worry, and that can be helped by cognitive behavior therapy and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. Then there's general anxiety disorder is excessive anxiety for 6 months. Cognitive behavior therapy, antidepressants, and anti-anxiety would help with this. Then there's OCD, which is intrusive repetitive behaviors and thoughts. SSRI medication and antidepressants could help. Then there's PTSD, which are flashbacks to certain events and nightmares. And exposure therapy and antipsychotic drugs would help. In case you were confused about the different treatments, biomedical treatments, these are what they are. Antipsychotics increases irrelevant stimuli, so this would help with people with schizophrenia, with people which are hallucinations and delusions or other thought disorders. Then there's anti-anxiety drugs, and these are used to control anxiety and agitation by depressing the central nervous system. And with other treatments, they can help like lower or lessen learned fears. And then there's antidepressants, which are agonists that increase the amount of neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine and serotonin. This leads to elevated mood and arousal, and this could help depression. And depression, like the definition, is 2 or more weeks of extreme sadness. And finally, there's mood stabilizing drugs, which also known as manic drugs, which helps people deal with the highs and lows. And this is especially with the bipolar, especially lithium. And remember, when diagnosing psychological disorders, they usually use the DSM-5, which is released by the American Psychological Association, in case that pops up on the test. Moving on is the social psychology, which is the last part. We only have 2 more slides left. So in social psychology, you should know about the group dynamics, which is how people interact. There's social facilitation, so that means that increases performance when you're performing in front of others. So say that you can't really make a basketball shot when you're by yourself, but when you're in front of a lot of people, you get really excited, and then your performance increases. And then the opposite is social inhibition, which would mean that you can shoot a lot of baskets in practice, but when you get to the game, all the stress and stuff, you get freaked out and you don't perform well. Next is social loafing, which laziness is when you're working in a group. So if you have a group project, everyone tends to put in less effort. Then there's social polarization, which is your exaggerating of initial values. So if you're split up into groups, you might get more and more polarized. Okay, next thing you should know is attribution, is how you assign responsibility for outcomes. When the fundamental attribution theory is when you mostly focus on like disposition, and you might like your feelings. That's how it has to do with what the outcomes is, so the situation. So if you go late to a job interview, the person who's interviewing you might just think that you're lazy but in reality you have a flat tire. So another thing you should know is self-serving bias is you contribute positive attributes to yourself and negative attributions to external factors. So say your school's basketball team wins, you always say, you'll say, oh, we won. But if they lose, you're gonna say, oh, they suck, they lost. Next thing you should know is the self-fulfilling prophecy is what you believe to happen will happen. So when attitudes contradict with behaviors, people often change the attitude, which is cognitive dissonance. Our last and final slide is talking about conformity, which is agreeing with the group. Compliance, which is you're acceding to requests although it goes against your interest. And when you're persuading someone, you can use the foot in the door technique is when you're making requests in small steps. So you ask for $5, then you ask for $10, and you ask for $15. The next thing is door in the face is when you start with big requests, then jump to small. So you might say, oh, I want $100, and then be like, okay, fine, I'll be good with 15. And when persuading someone, there's central root persuasion, which use facts and logics and strengthen the arguments. There's peripheral root persuasion, which you look at other things besides that, so like how attractive the speaker is. Then and next thing you should know is role playing, which you take up the role of the character. The example of this is the Stanford prison experiments, where they assigned some students as prisoners and some students as guards, and they pretended that they were that, and they were taking up the role. Then there was bystander effect, which is the diffusion of responsibility. So if there's many people walking on a street, and then there's someone falls, many people won't stop and help them because they'll think that someone else will do it for them. Then you should know about in-group, which is the group that you in-group and out-group. In-group is the group that's in, and the out-group is one that's out, so you think that they're enemies. Scapegoat is when you blame the out-group. Discrimination is when you treat the out-group negatively. Okay, that's the end of our video. I hope you guys found this review helpful. And I hope you all do well in your AP Psychology exam. Bye.